again, thank you all for coming. Peter, nice to see you. I haven't seen Peter in a while. I'm Simon Rosenberg from NDN and the New Policy Institute, and I'm here just to welcome those of us in the room and then anyone watching online to what's going to be an interesting event. We're joined by a wonderful panel here today, led by Ramirez, who's our Senior Vice President for Hispanic Programs, and has his fingers in many political cookie jars out there in Washington and around the country. And I'm not going to go through all the introductions, but I also just want to acknowledge Frank Sharry, our dear friend, and who's been such an extraordinary warrior for so many years in this not such an easy place sometimes. But and I just want to say it's good to see you again, Frank. We haven't seen Frank in a while. Just one brief comment about NDN and our historic involvement in this, then I'll turn it over to Andres. Is that
Frank?
To Frank, okay. Yeah. Is that sorry, a little closer to my mouth, and I have to be handled here. Is that we have been making an argument for years that there's a new politics being born in America, and it's being driven by three big changes. First is that there's a new governing agenda that's emerging that's very different from the 20th century challenges we faced. That new media and technology are changing the way we communicate, advocate, organize, and govern. And third is that the people of America are going through profound change. That if you take the vast waves of immigration and just all the demographic changes that are going on, we may be going through the most profound demographic changes in America since the arrival of the Europeans here in the 16th and 17th century, 15th, 16th, and 17th century. And that on the third point, we have been working for years to try to help educate policymakers and leaders about this incredible demographic transition in order to do our best to make sure that this transition is a good one, and that the obvious bumps in the road along the way, as any civil society changes at the rate that America's changing, that there are going to be fights and contention and difficulties, and as a civil society has to resolve these new tensions and absorb these new people and these new cultures and these new ways. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing for years is helping try to, I think, help ease this transition and to make it more likely that the pain to America is lessened and actually the upside of everything that's happening is greater. And so I'm proud in that spirit today to welcome this panel, which is going to be diving into in great detail the manifestation, one of the manifestations of this extraordinary transition that's going on in the country, which is the rising political power of the Latino community in the United States and its impact on the census and the reapportionment that's coming, certainly, which will be of great interest to many around the country. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Frank Sharry, welcome. Take it away.
Sir. Well, welcome. And first of all, I want to thank Simon and NDN for hosting this event, also for contributing mightily to the work that went into the report that we're releasing today. And really looking forward to hearing from the expert panel we have. I'll just make sure you know who's on the panel, say a few words, and then hand it over to Andres to get us kicked off. Andres Ramirez, the Senior Vice President, Director of Hispanic Programs at NDN, will be our first speaker. He'll be followed by a longtime colleague and friend, Arturo Vargas, who's the Executive Director of NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. Good thing you have an acronym. But Arturo is really one of the leading advocates and experts on the census and the politics of Latinos in America, so we look forward to hearing from him. And then we're going to hear from Kim Brace, the President of Election Data Services, which does the incredibly complex work of really looking at the census and redistricting and what's likely to happen. So we have three of the best people in the country to analyze what's happening. Let me just say a few words about why we decided to look at this. I think it's become pretty clear from the 2004 presidential race and the 2008 election that the growing importance of the Latino vote was showcased in those two elections. President Bush in 2004 ran, I think what most experts believe is a brilliant campaign, really focused on Spanish-dominant voters in key swing states, and performed miraculously. It's hard to remember given what's happened since then, but the overall vote, the Latino vote, remember Bob Dole won 21% of the Latino vote in 1996, and George Bush won 40% of an expanded electorate. There's some debate about what the exact percentage is, but I think 40% is what experts agree on. More importantly, the best evidence of what happened with the Spanish-dominant Latino voter is that John Kerry beat George W. Bush with Spanish-dominant voters 52% to 48%. In other words, the fast-growing Spanish-dominant voters that are helping to grow the overall Latino vote swung pretty significantly towards George W. Bush and helped him win a number of key swing states. That was reversed in 2008 in the key swing states of Florida, of Colorado, of New Mexico, and Nevada, where you had Barack Obama really perform remarkably well with Latino voters. A huge turnout, what Arturo, probably an extra 2 million Latino voters from 2004, and a percentage in which Barack Obama won 67% to 31% for McCain. And the best evidence of the Spanish-dominant vote, just to try to do an apples-to-apples comparison, is that Obama won the Spanish-dominant vote over John McCain by 75% to 25%. That's a remarkable shift. Fast-growing, the Spanish-dominant voters representing as much as 40% of the overall Latino vote, turning out in big numbers and swinging dramatically away from the Republican candidate to the Democratic candidate. And it helped swing. I think most people talk about the 4 states that were well known in terms of New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, and Florida, but lesser known, but known among political operatives, that the small percentage of Latino votes in states like Pennsylvania, Indiana, and North Carolina helped play a decisive role, in Virginia as well. So, so that is a backdrop. We said, well, what about congressional races? What about state legislative races? What's likely to happen there? So we're going to do a series of reports, starting with looking at the numbers, the census. Assuming there's a good count coming out of the census, there's going to be a very important, politically consequential redistricting process that will result. Who's likely to lose seats? Who's likely to win seats? And then in follow-up reports, we'll be looking at what are Latino voters talking about, what do they care about going into the 2010 elections, and then looking at specific races and how the growing numbers may play out. So this is the first of a series of reports looking at the Latino vote going forward in more of a congressional and state legislative frame. And we wanted to understand how many voters, where are they, and what impact it'll have on the redistricting process. So without further ado, let me hand it over to someone who contributed mightily to the report, Andres Ramirez of NDN. Andres?
Thank you, Frank. Sounded a little loud. Yeah. Well, first again, I'm gonna let Tech deal with this. We ready? Yeah, I think that's better. I want to thank America's Voice for taking the initiative and leadership to wanting to put a report like this together. This report, as the architect of it, Lynn Tremont, will tell folks, has been going on for months and months and months, and has been considered almost a childbirth to her, that we're now unveiling it, because she's been dealing with it for about 9 months now. But this was a great initiative that they came to Indiana with and said, this would be an incredible project for us to begin to look at. One of the things that I have consistently said over the years to many as I speak on panels and give information on the research we have is that, there is just an incredible lack of information and access to quality information regarding Latinos and the Latino electorate in general. And so this report, I think, does an incredible job of putting some quality information, bridging it together, tying it how it's important, how it will impact not just the community, but elections and reapportionment in general, that I think you'll find it very useful. So thank you, America's Voice, for taking the leadership on that. Also, as mentioned, Arturo Vargas is just a hero in our community and has been around, for generations, I'm going to say, because there's certainly political generations that he's left, to really take a lead on pushing for communities and states to take into account what the Latino voter registration and turnout has been, and NALEO has just been done a great job to making sure that we're pushing this issue forward. And also election data services. I've been stealing Mr. Brace's information for years because it's just some of the best information out there. And so as I do targeting and analysis of congressional districts and turnouts and counties and states, and not only just on reapportionment, but on electoral participation as well, EDS just does a fantastic job. So I'm really proud to be on the panel with all of them. As Simon mentioned, NDN has been at the forefront of doing some research and analysis on the emerging Latino electorate and how it will impact campaigns for the past decade. And so part of my work here is to continue that analysis and that research to help figure out how much more we can determine and find out to help educate, political parties and nonpartisan groups as to how this constituency and this community works. So what I want to do now is just spend some time going over some of the top lines in this report and talk about the importance that Latinos will play not only in the elections but also in the reapportionment process. And I think first and foremost what I want to say is that the Latino electorate has been consistently increasing both their total number of voters as well as the share of the electorate. And this pattern is demonstrated not only in states along the southern border, as is mostly expected, but also in states all across the country. And as this trend continues, it will be increasingly difficult for any candidate to win either a state or a national election without the support of Latino voters. And so where we get to this is this report shows that as Latinos are increasing their participation in states like Texas, which is expected to gain about 4 congressional seats, and also in states like Georgia, which is expected to gain a traditional seat, that the traditional political norms that you only focus on the Latino electorate in the Southwest will no longer hold true. That, as Frank mentioned and this report mentioned, that states like Indiana, states like Virginia, we have Lenny Gonzalez here, states like South Carolina, and so forth, will also begin to have an increased participation from candidates, parties, and outside organizations in terms of mobilizing and researching and working with the Latino electorate. We certainly saw it in 2008, that Latinos played a significant role. And as these states continue to become more competitive and they continue to stay as battleground states, the Latino electorate, which by all standards is still largely considered a swing electorate, will continue to maintain these states competitive. As Simon mentioned, I participate in a lot of political circles, and it's no secret that I am a prominent Democrat, but today I'm playing my neutral role, so I'm wearing my purple tie. Because this issue is important, and it's not just about a Democrat issue or a Republican issue, but this is about an American issue and how Latinos are becoming a part of the American fabric and changing and reshaping the way we view policy and politics in America. So, as we're looking at this, again, we're also going to look at states like Oregon, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, states like New Jersey, states that have historically not been viewed as what you call a Latino state, where the Hispanic and Latino community is growing significantly, that these candidates who are running statewide or national campaigns who are running that will need to compete in these states are going to have to incorporate how their campaign, how their policies, and how their positions on issues are going to play with the Hispanic electorate. The report, and this is incredible because the report shows that 6 of the 8 states expected to increase their congressional delegation size would most likely not have gained all these extra seats had it not been for the Latino population. And so, and not only that, but also states that are losing congressional seats, that they may have fared worse had it not been for the increase in Latino population in that. And you see that in states specifically like Pennsylvania, where 120% of the population growth in Pennsylvania has been Latinos. Pennsylvania is expected to lose a seat, and had no Hispanics increased in population, they may have fared even worse. And so what we are seeing is that regardless of whether your state is gaining a seat or losing a seat, that Latinos are increasing their political clout in your state. You're going to have states like Nevada and Texas, which are growing in congressional size, and where the Latino electorate is going to play a greater role. And some of these seats may even be drawn where Latinos can get elected in these congressional seats, which I'm sure is something that many hope, including my friend Arturo Vargas, that we get more representation of Latino electeds. But even in states, again, like Pennsylvania and otherwise, where they're going to have less congressional seats available to them, that means there's going to be more Hispanics spread out over a fewer number of seats. So their share and percentage of representation in each district will increase, which will make them become more valuable to the members of Congress who have those seats. So we look at this and you say, well, great, they're increasing their numbers and there's great population size and so forth, but will that really play? And the one thing for people here in Washington is that we know there's very few things that politicians care about more than self-preservation. And getting reelected and maintaining their seat is one of the key things they hold in mind as they make decisions, as they conduct votes in Congress. And so as the Latino electorate becomes more of a factor and more important to them and their communities, these politicians, these elected officials, are going to begin to calculate much more effectively and much more seriously, how will this policy impact this growing Latino community in my district? And is this now an issue that may or may not cause my defeat and or re-election in the upcoming election? And so we will begin to see issues on everything from healthcare to economy to climate change and yes, immigration, where politicians who are now seeing the increase both in population and participation at the ballot box increase among this community, that they will begin to, one, reevaluate their position, if they have a position on these issues now, or begin to evaluate in earnest what their position may be on issues that will impact this community, as it may or may not impact their own re-election. Again, self-preservation is a phenomenal aspect that plays in this town. So as these are beginning true, we've seen significantly already this past year, again, on issues like healthcare, on the stimulus, on the Census Amendment, Arturo and NALEO, as well as various other groups, we joined together to do a coalition to defeat efforts by Senator Vitter and David Bennett to eliminate funding from the census unless it was added an 11th question that many felt would disrupt an orderly census and was discriminatory to a large segment of our population. These issues that have been coming up, these issues where you have, again, a stimulus bill where people are wondering how this may impact or how to exclude immigrants, politicians are going to begin to reevaluate their position on these issues. And we're beginning to see that more true, that it's not just, again, no longer a Democrat or Republican issue, but it's an American issue. And we saw this recently on the House side with House Republicans who many thought were going to introduce an amendment to exclude immigrants from their health care resolution. Instead, they chose to add a separate amendment on tort reform. And part of the reasoning is that their polling is showing the same polling that we have, that although being anti-immigrant or anti-Hispanic may appeal significantly to their base, that Hispanics still are in earnest or a swing vote, and that voters care much more about true solutions to their problems. And if Hispanics are playing a key role on this as well, we're going to see they're going to evaluate and change their position on many of these issues, as opposed to just beginning to push issues that many find intolerant and discriminatory. So with that, I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Arturo, and then I'm sure you guys will have many questions, and I'm more than happy to go into more of the numbers if needed.
Thank you, Andres, and let's hear from Arturo Vargas of NALEO.
Thank you, Frank, and good afternoon, everybody. First, thank you to America's Voice for the work on this report and NDN for hosting this event. And, this report focuses on what is perhaps the most exciting, sexiest, exhilarating aspect of political life in the United States, and that is redistricting and reapportioning political power in the United States. But before we can get to that point, there's something mundane that we have to get done, and that is to count everybody. Because if you don't have the numbers, you don't have anything to work with when it comes time to reapportioning the Congress and redistricting. So what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes talking about how are we doing in terms of preparing for the count in 2010, and how are we doing with respect to enumerating the Latino population. Well, suffice it to say that I think the best we can do at this point is to avert a major crisis in terms of the 2010 census. There are a number of factors that are affecting the enumeration of 2010 that place the enumeration of Latinos at great risk. First of all, one constellation of factors I would put at the Census Bureau. That the Census Bureau itself has had to pivot twice over the past couple of years as it's gone toward 2010. The first pivoting had to occur in changing its whole methodology for counting people. They wanted this to be the high-tech census. They were going to use handheld computers like PDAs to enumerate, home to home for those homes that did not reply to their census forms, did not return them. Well, they didn't work. So they had to pivot and go back to a traditional method, which means paper and pencil, which means there was some planning that needed to be redone in terms of preparing for 2010. It means a greater workforce needed to be employed, more enumerators, and different strategies, rather than using handheld computers, but using paper and pencil. Second thing is, appropriately so, this census has been planned during much of the last decade. It was planned in 2005, 2006, and 2007. It was not planned for an enumeration to occur during a recession, during the greatest economic crisis this country has seen since World War II. So as a consequence, the Bureau has also had to pivot and change its strategies to enumerate a population that is suffering from the worst foreclosure crisis, the worst displacement of homes that we have seen in generations. And why that affects the census is because the census at its basic element is a mail-out, mail-back survey. If you own a home and you're living the American dream, chances are you're going to be counted because you have an address, you're going to get your census form, you'll complete it, and you'll return it, and you're counted. But if you're living an economic nightmare because you've lost your job, you've lost your home, you're now displaced from your home, you're sharing a home with another family, perhaps 2 or 3 families living together, and all of a sudden you're being asked to participate in this big civic celebration called the 2010 census, that's going to be a tough sell. And that's exactly the challenge we have before us. And then the third thing that I would put in terms of the Census Bureau's domain as to a challenge going to 2010 is that for a number of months, the Census Bureau did not have the kind of strong leadership that it needed to prepare for 2010. There was the ambiguity of who was going to be the director of the Census Bureau, the transition from one administration to another that also introduced a sense of paralysis among some at the Census Bureau, and decisions that needed to be made were not being made because the Bureau was waiting for the political team to come into place. Well, we're there now, and now we're playing catch-up and trying to make sure that 2010 happens. So that was one constellation of issues. The second constellation of issues that is really imperiling the census is the fact that the nonprofit sector really is not prepared to participate. This is my third census in terms of working with nonprofit organizations to complement and augment what the Census Bureau is going to do to educate everybody about the importance of the census. This is the first census in the past 3 that I've seen where it is only 4 months out that organizations are being organized around the census. There are still cities out there, key metropolitan areas, that do not yet even have a complete count committee. I come from the city of LA. I was appointed to the complete count committee by the mayor of Los Angeles, a committee of 12. There have been 6 appointments. We're still waiting for the other 6. And we're still waiting for a meeting 4 months before the census itself. Los Angeles, which arguably is the most difficult to count metropolitan area in the country. Public funds are not available like they were in previous censuses. In 2000, California allocated $25 million to complement what the Census Bureau was doing. This year, California is going to throw in $2 million. And it's the same story across the country with cities and states lacking the resources to put in their own outreach efforts to complement what the Census Bureau is doing. And the philanthropy has not been stepping up as in previous censuses. It's only been in the past really 3 months that we have seen foundations step up to the plate and start making grants to organizations to do their own census outreach work. And what grants they're making are not of the size and vigor that they were in 2000 and in 1990. So that's the second constellation of issues. The third constellation of issues that is imperiling the census is that at no time in the history of the United States has this population been so difficult to enumerate. And let me speak specifically here about Latinos and about immigrants. First of all, the recession that I referred to earlier has had no greater impact on any other population than on Latinos. Latino males today have the highest unemployment rate of any population group. Latinos are suffering the highest foreclosure rate of any other population because they were the most likely to be victims to the subprime loans. There's been an increase in poverty as a consequence of this recession, and poverty is probably the strongest indicator of being missed in the census. We are talking about this new population that is now dispersed in all these non-traditional states, not just in the Southwest. They're in states like Georgia and the Carolinas and Tennessee and Arkansas and Oklahoma. What is that same dispersion that is introducing a new challenge to enumerate these populations? So the Census Bureau has a track record, albeit not very good, of counting Latinos in California and in Texas and New Mexico and Florida. Now the challenge is, how do we count Latinos in Tennessee, and in Oklahoma, and in Arkansas. In those states where we're just barely seeing the establishment of a social service, civic engagement infrastructure, the creation of those trusted messengers that the Census Bureau so much relies upon to carry its message. You know, the local CBO leader who's a Latino, the local minister or priest who's a Latino, who's a trusted messenger. Those kinds of leaders are just being developed as this community is developing its infrastructure. So that introduces a new challenge. And then we have, you know, efforts to suppress the Latino count. You know, efforts like what Andres referred to, Senator Vitter's amendment, which is nothing new. We saw it in 1990, we saw it in 2000, so we saw it again in 2010, big deal. But now we have some individuals of our community who are suggesting that Latinos boycott the census, which to me is the most irresponsible and immoral thing to do, to suggest that anybody make themselves invisible in this country, that they be declared 0% of a person under our Constitution. The legacy of racism in this country is embedded in the census. The first censuses counted African American slaves as only 3/5 of a person, and some Native Americans as 0% of a person. So for anybody to suggest that Latino immigrants should revert to making themselves, declaring themselves as 0% of a person under our Constitution, to me, is again, irresponsible and immoral. And then the last thing is that this is the first census in which Latinos are the nation's second largest population group. The fact remains that we cannot have a successful 2010 census without an accurate count of Latinos. Latinos count for half of the population growth in this country. This nation grows by a person every 15 seconds. Every 30 seconds, that person is a Latino or a Latina. So we have a job to do. That was the census. The second dynamic about turning these numbers then into true political power is going to be a fair redistricting process. And as Andres mentioned, redistricting is about self-preservation by incumbents, but the struggle is not just going to happen in Washington, D.C. It's going to happen in 50 state capitals around the country. We know what happened in Texas over the past decade. So we need now greater scrutiny and vigorous enforcement of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, as well as Section 2, by this Department of Justice to make sure that Texas complies with the Voting Rights Act with its 4 new congressional seats, should it get that many. And that same kind of vigor and scrutiny is going to need to be applied in Nevada and in Arizona and in Georgia and North Carolina to ensure that in none of those states, minority voters who are protected under the Voting Rights Act, which include African Americans, Latinos, and Asians, and Native Americans, are not denied the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice or to influence these elections. There are some new dynamics because we know in some of these states, the responsibility of redistricting has been taken away from legislatures and given to independent commissions. We saw that in Arizona. We saw the problems the Arizona redistricting had in 2000. Now with increased seats for Arizona, there's a potential for even greater disenfranchisement in that state. California has a new process that takes away the legislative redistricting process away from the legislature, gives it to an independent commission, but keeps the responsibility of drawing congressional lines with the legislature. So now you're going to have parallel tracks in California that the public and advocates are going to have to monitor, which puts us at a fundamental disadvantage to monitor what's happening with redistricting. And the last thing I'd mention about what to me is most remarkable about this reapportionment that we've seen is that it will be the first apportionment in memory that California will now pick up a congressional seat. And quite likely, quite possibly, may even lose a congressional seat. That's something remarkable to me because we haven't seen that in decade after decade after decade, which speaks volumes about the impact of the recession it has had in that state.
Thank you very much, Arturo. And last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Kim Brace, the President of Election Data Services. Kim?
Thank you there. Want to thank the groups that participated in this and put this study together. It provides some important clues of where we're going as a nation. And clearly, as Arturo says, there's a lot of different factors that come into being in terms of the overall conducting the census. We follow closely the census and trying to see where the numbers are going to be. So we've put together the study that is the basis of this study to take a look at where's the population growth moving towards. It's following that traditional kind of pattern that we've seen really since World War II, going from the northeast to the south and to the west. But as Arturo says, there's been a new fundamental change going on in this country in just this last year, year and a half. And some of it may not even be reflected in these numbers here today. The Census Bureau will be putting out a new set of numbers just next month towards Christmas, New Year's, where we'll see their latest estimates of the population change for 2009, at which point in time we'll put together another study in terms of looking at the congressional delegation. That may give us a better clue of certainly what is the problem that has taken place in this country in terms of the foreclosure, the depression, the recession that has been going on. Because these numbers in 2008 were basically put together in the summer of 2008 before this whole recession took place. So we're likely to see some significant and further changes even as we get newer numbers coming this fall. And then, of course, we have the census. As Arturo says, whether or not the census will take a full and complete count is one critical factor here. It is much more difficult this time than it has been. I've done redistricting and working with the census for the last 3 decades, and they are posed with enormous difficulties this time that they haven't seen before. And so this will cause the potential of people being uncounted. We've seen a steady progression downward of the undercount rate. Indeed, in 2000, they thought it was the best census ever. The question is will it continue that trend, or will we see an upturn in terms of the undercount? The minority community is greatly affected by that sort of thing because they are the ones that are undercounted more than the majority community. So the issue becomes is how well will the census be taken this time and how well the numbers will come out. Those numbers will be there for the reapportionment data. That set of numbers has to come out by December 31st of 2010. That is the first final numbers that will come out of the census. Just 4 months later, the data, the more detailed data down to the census block level will come out by April 1st of 2011 and will be given to each of the 50 states. That's when the fun starts. That's when the redistricting starts. That's when all of the different factors that we've been talking about come into play, where people will really get for the first time to see down at very micro community level what is taking place in their state. And we will see for the first time what is the change in the demographic makeup. We have seen over the past 30 years significant demographic changes, the growth of the Hispanic community. This will now come into fruition as we see these numbers in April of 2011. So that will start the redistricting process. Redistricting will take place in each of the 50 states, but it's not only a state function. It's not only the drawing of the congressional districts. It's not only the drawing of the state legislative districts, but it's also the drawing of local districts, county commission seats, county council seats, city council seats. All of those, anytime you have single-member districts, they will have to be redrawn with the new population data coming from the census. And so all of this change will take place in 2011, leading up to the 2012 election. Certainly by the time we get 2012 is a presidential election. We'll have presidential preference primaries starting in God knows what, January or December of 2011 maybe, who knows, the way the presidential primaries are going. But certainly all of that process will start dictating when those lines have to be drawn by, because those final lines have to be drawn for the first election where you're going to have single-member districts run. So that will take place in 2011 and 2012. And it'll continue through probably the summertime when the final filing deadlines for the primaries will take place. And then we'll probably end up in court because not everybody will be happy. I've always had a scenario from redistricting. I know I've done a good job if everyone is just a little bit mad at me when you do redistricting, because that's what takes place. On the redistricting side, there's a lot of contention, there's a lot of controversy, and certainly understanding the numbers is one of the most fundamental things that one has to do. So studying those census numbers and studying what the impact will have on the Hispanic community is one of the most important things that we have. So it's good that we've got this study, one of the first in the series, and we'll see what else can come out.
Thank you very much, Kim. So we're going to open it up for questions in just a moment. I just want to, again, underscore that I think one of the most interesting findings in this report is that the states that are going to gain seats as a result of the growth of the Latino population are generally what you would call red states, red districts. And I think it poses a real challenge for the Republican Party, which, unlike George W. Bush, who ran such a successful effort to connect with Latino voters in 2004, I think 2008 was something of what we tend to refer to as el voto castigo, the punishment vote against the Republican Party for the demonization of Latinos, and particularly Latino immigrants, starting in 2005 with the infamous Sensenbrenner bill. And so it's going to really be a challenge to Republican members of Congress, starting in Texas. Texas is going to gain 4 seats. And the redistricting process, as we saw in the past, is likely to be highly controversial and very important and of consequence.
We no longer have Tom DeLay, so
well,
it might be a little easier.
I understand Texas politics hasn't changed all that much, but Arizona's going to gain 2 seats, Florida a seat, Georgia, Nevada, Oregon, South Carolina, Utah. So this is going to set up a very interesting dynamic, because right now the kind of bleached districts where candidates can get away with demonizing Latino immigrants because they're more worried about a primary challenge than a general election loss may end in the next decade in a way that could be very interesting in terms of policy, as Andre said, across a number of fronts, including the issue that I work on, immigration reform. In any case, let's open it up for questions now.
And just, I'm going to get dinged back home if I don't correct you, but it's Nevada.
Nevada.
Nevada. And so my home state people are going to get upset at me if I don't make that correction.
I'll pronounce this right. Antonieta.
Thank you, Frank. Antonieta Cádiz from La Opinión. Frank, I was wondering if you have shared these numbers in Congress, and what is the answer that you have get so far?
Yeah, we just released it today at noon, so we will be sharing it. But I'll say this, that politicians have a keen sense of self-preservation. And so, for example, I think you're seeing a debate among Texas Republicans in a way that you haven't in the past. John Cornyn is a very interesting bellwether, but even members of Congress, they realize their districts are changing dramatically. And since they're interested in re-election, they have to start to figure out the calculation in the past has been that there's not that many of them and they don't show up and vote and they don't really care about, say, immigration. That calculation is very different now. And yet at the same time, they're afraid of primary opponents who may challenge them if they don't hew to a hardline base view of immigration. So they're in a very difficult spot, and I think there's going to be different attempts to change it, to try different things. I'll give you another example where I think this is playing out. Love to hear Arturo's view on this. I think in California, the governor's race is going to be extremely interesting because Meg Whitman, who has a modest lead in the polls, running for the Republican nomination for governor, has specifically distinguished herself as pro-immigration. She went down to the border and said, we need to find a way to have the people here without papers to have a fair process so they can get in the system. That is a remarkable development. If she happens to win the race, she's going to be the Republican who's going to be leading the new Republican Party to making them viable again for national elections, because it's pretty clear now that unless the Republican Party changes its brand identification as the anti-Latino immigrant party, it's going to be hard to win in states like Florida and the Southwest. So I think you're going to see, we'll see. I think it's going to be mixed for you. I think in other areas you'll see people running to the right because they're more concerned about primary challenges than generals.
Yeah, I think it would be a great irony that it was a California Republican who drove Hispanics away from the Republican Party to have Meg Whitman possibly bring him back if she actually wins. But I'm not sure we're fully there yet.
I'm not sure. Arturo, do you want to comment on this?
Well, I think one of the things we shouldn't forget about are the 2010 midterm elections, because it's the elections at these state legislative levels that we're going to elect, in most states, the legislative bodies who are going to be doing the redistricting. So in Texas, for example, the Texas House of Representatives is split only by 2 seats between Democrats and Republicans. If Democrats are able to pick up 1 or 2 seats, Democrats then are in a much stronger influence redistricting in that state than they were now. And then the governors, of course, have veto power. So Meg Whitman theoretically would have veto power over the congressional lines that are drawn for the state of California, not the state legislative lines, because those now are going to be drawn by this independent commission. So the midterm elections, I think, are of absolute key importance. And then the thing not to forget about, though, that in these red states that are picking up congressional districts, some of these folks may be able to get a pass because they're adding a seat. So no incumbent, in theory, would necessarily have to give up their seat, as opposed to those states that are losing districts. The danger here would be efforts to try to pack minorities, Latinos, African Americans in as few districts as possible, which would be a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, if in fact diminishes their influence in elections. So to me, the most important thing that the Obama administration can do over the next years is to really gear up its Department of Justice and its voting rights section to make sure that this redistricting process happens in a way that we don't see the kind of things that we saw in 2000, which frankly, both parties are guilty of in terms of when it comes to undermining the voting strength of Latinos, both Democrats and Republicans.
Great.
Before we move on to the next question, I just want to remind for the viewers online watching the streaming video that if you have any questions, to please submit them online, and one of our staff here will be able to get those questions and ask them to the panel. So just want to make sure I reminded the viewers online about that. Go ahead.
Great. Go ahead. I saw your hand back here. Could you please identify yourself as well?
Hi, I'm Patricia Gaitan. I'm actually a Census PR contractor. I have a question for Arturo. If you could describe if there is a correlation between the seats that we're gaining in Texas versus the seat we're losing in Louisiana. Does that have something to do with Katrina victims that moved to Dallas and Houston? And obviously the lack of we knew there was a boom in Hispanic population to help rebuild, but certainly not significant enough to gain or keep it steady.
Yeah, in fact, the displacement of population as a result of Katrina and Rita is presenting one of the biggest challenges for the Census Bureau, and the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights recently published a report that analyzed what the challenges were for the Gulf Coast. But regardless of that, Texas's population increase has been because Texas's economy is doing pretty well. Real estate is cheap, there are jobs in Texas, people are being drawn to that state. One of the more remarkable dynamics of the 2006 marches was how surprised the local leaders were as to how many people turned out for the big march in Dallas. They had over 500,000 people in Dallas. And all of a sudden, it dawning among the leadership of Dallas that city now was over 40% Latino. Usually you thought of Latinos being in Houston and in the Rio Grande Valley. And
San
now,
Antonio.
well, San Antonio, that's a given. So where would these seats pop up? Probably in Dallas, probably in Houston, and probably in the Rio Grande Valley.
Right. Let's go here and then here. Sorry, we'll just keep going.
Rich Cohen with National Journal Magazine. I'd like to pick up on the point one of you made about obvious point that the Latino population is now the second largest group in America. From a congressional perspective, as you know, there's roughly half as many Latino members as there are African American members of the House. What is and there was disappointment in the Latino community after that you didn't pick up as many seats after the 2000 reapportionment as had been hoped. What are the expectations and hopes now for how many seats you can pick pick up roughly nationwide for 2012, and talk a little bit in that context of, yes, it's true that there's a big increase in the population, but to what extent does that translate into an increase in voting age and voting eligible population? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a great question. I'll start off by saying that, and as Arturo mentioned, he's been working on this for a few decades, is that one of the big differences between 2000 and now is just the maturity factor in and of itself among the Hispanics and Latinos who live in this country that have become more engaged, have become more participatory in the election process. Where we are now is dramatically, significantly much farther along than we were during the 2000 process, both in terms of numbers and in terms of participation. And that just has a lot to do with just the changing dynamics that have happened over this country, not just due to the population, but the issues that happen, and as Frank mentioned, the Sensenbrenner issue and the mobilization of Hispanics and their maturity and understanding the importance of participating in electing numbers. So I would just say, first, we're in a dramatically much different place we are now than we were back then. On the other portion, I would say, obviously, I think it would be great on a personal level and for groups in NALEO to see an increase in Latino representation at the congressional level as well as state and local level. But I wouldn't categorize it simply because there are districts that have significant Hispanics aren't electing a Latino population, that Latinos are not increasing their political clout and they're not still electing their candidate of choice. I don't think it has to be a Latino elected in these districts in order for Latinos to be exercising their political power. And so I would certainly just raise that fact that it doesn't have to be a Latino elected in these districts for it to be an important election or an important candidate.
What I would add is that, we're in this for the long haul. The true Latino fulfillment of our potential politically will not happen with any single reapportionment, any single redistricting process, or any single election. It's a long road that we've been on now for a number of decades that has included promoting naturalization among legal permanent residents and seeing the kind of milestones we saw in the mid-90s in California, where over 1 million Latinos were introduced into the California electorate, which fundamentally changed California politics. The million immigrants who naturalized in 2008 in time to vote in November, 44% of whom were from Latin American countries. It's the 50,000 Latinos citizens who turn 18 years of age every month. It's integrating these new elements of the electorate and having them come of age and become citizens at a time when Latinos are on the rise politically. So every new citizen who is naturalizing today is doing so in a very politically charged environment. And if you speak to a new citizen and you ask them, why are you naturalizing today? The response typically is, because I want to vote. And you know something about naturalized citizens? They're voters.
I haven't heard a number yet from any of you.
A number on?
Increased number.
Well, if Texas were to pick up 4 seats, if Texas were to pick up 4 congressional seats, I would argue 3 of them, at minimum, should be Latino, districts where Latinos could elect candidates of their choice. Certainly something in Southern Nevada and Las Vegas when consider that population increase. Perhaps 1 of the 2 seats in Arizona are the seats that I would identify as most likely to be seats where Latinos could elect candidates of choice.
Great. And there's also some very good statistics. Good on page 5 of the report, you'll see the increases in the percentage of registered voters, voters who've turned out, and so forth. So it's not just a community that's growing in numbers, it's growing in its political participation. I'm sorry.
We had one more question.
Yeah, one more question here, and then we'll go.
We have some online questions.
Thank you. Ruben Barrera with the Mexican News Agency, Notimex. Given the increasing power and influence that you are giving the Latino population, and also the importance that this community is going to have in the process to redistrict political districts in the country, I wonder to what point this repositioning of the Latinos in the political arena could result in less demonizing campaigns coming out from Congress.
Just to make sure I understand you, that the increase of involvement of Latinos in the political redrawing, how will that affect in decreasing the amount of demonization of the Latino community? It's a great question.
Well, I'll take a crack at it. Yeah.
I would just say the issue of demonization is by a very small segment of elected officials from a very conservative wing, primarily in the Republican Party, who feel that it's more important to play to people's fears than to play to their reasoning. And I don't think that those members who are so bent that that is part of their DNA will change as an increase. What we will see, though, is there will be, I don't think you're going to have an increase of new electeds that will be elected in this new generation, this new demography, this new community, which will be more willing to engage in those types of fear-mongering and scapegoating and demonization of immigrants, because they will have come of age politically in a different environment than those that are in there now, who largely were elected and or chose to become elected because of their natural tendencies.
Can I go back and add a number to your question? Central Florida. Central Florida.
I was wondering whether Florida counted. I would say, Ruben, that this report is a challenge to both parties. Obviously, Republicans have, as a party, gotten on the wrong side of history with respect to the fastest growing group of voters in the country. And they're going to have to sue for peace on immigration. They're going to have to stop demagoguing immigration in the healthcare context. And I think, as Andres points out, it is significant that on this motion to recommit, they didn't use the immigration issue. Some of us suspect in part because they realize it's not the winner they thought it was going to be. I mean, the Republican Party tried this illegal immigration as a wedge issue in 2006 and 2008, and those were not successful elections for the Republican Party. And there's very few races you can point to where you could say it may have worked a little bit, and many races where it backfired. So I think that the Republican Party, and we'll see this in the immigration reform debate next year, whether there's enough Republicans that want to, as Simon Rosenberg would say, sue for peace and get this issue off the table so that they can compete for Latino voters on other grounds. For the Democrats, I don't think they've quite internalized the fact that they have an opportunity to consolidate support among this group of voters. And for many, they're still scared of the issue of immigration, and they're not quite sure how to connect with this community. Lenny's here from Virginia. I mean, Cree Deeds, is a classic example of a Democrat who didn't get it and ran a terrible campaign in Virginia in a way that gave him almost no shot to bring out the kind of voters that turned out in 2008. So, and many centrist Democrats who are blue dogs and are in what they consider swing states are concerned about whether they're going to alienate white voters by somehow seeming to care about Latino voters. And I think that they're going to have to get it. I mean, Latino voters, and Arturo knows this, I learned it from him, Latino voters are quintessentially American voters. They have the same concerns, but when you say, we don't like you, we don't like your family, and we want to deport them, it offends people.
Yeah.
It's if your campaign strategy is, let's tell those people we don't like them, it's kind of, at some point you are going to have a reaction. And that's what's happened. And just so I think both parties have to get it. The Democrats have to lean into this issue and connect with this community in a way that they understand what they're dealing with. And Democrats have to stop playing to a fringe base that is getting them nothing but minority status. And I think, quite frankly, next year in the immigration debate will be a huge test for centrist Democrats and for right-wing Republicans on both those scores. Yeah, online questions. You? Go ahead, why don't you read it?
Okay, this is from Linda Perez from Mundo Hispánico in Georgia. She asks, do you foresee a change in attitudes toward Latinos from policymakers and leaders in states in the Southeast, particularly in Georgia?
I would reiterate, as I mentioned during my remarks, that I would say yes. I think we're seeing that now. And again, the issue of self-preservation. The Latino community in Georgia has exploded percentage-wise, larger than any other Latino community in the country in terms of growth and political participation. And as they continue to grow, and as we see organizations like NALEO and other groups participate and get involved, these elected officials are going to have to pay greater attention and involve and evaluate the importance of the Latino vote much greater than other states. So I would definitely say yes.
But let me dig a little deeper on this. Because Arturo, I mean, most of us know that the current treatment of Latino immigrants in particular, which is a big part of the growth in Georgia, I mean, it's pretty rough. They're exposed to some very aggressive sheriffs who are targeting Latinos. There's a sense of living under siege. And this, Latinos in the South in particular are not experiencing the kind of acceptance that you see in the big cities across America. So these new immigrant states, particularly in the South, are kind of notorious in the Latino immigrant community as tough places to be. How do you see the old guard reacting to new numbers and changing in districts?
Well, I think this presents an interesting opportunity for a new level of coalition building between African Americans and Latinos. And I think if the leadership of both communities could see what they have in common in terms of issues that affect people who are being affected by the recession, by foreclosures, by an educational system that doesn't work for their children, that there could be some interesting coalition building between these two communities to give rise to a new South.
And I would say while we're talking about coalitions in Georgia, I just want to make sure that we remember that this coalition of various groups got together to help get Lou Dobbs off the air from a company based out of Atlanta, Georgia, called CNN. And so I think we're certainly seeing some dynamics change there. And want to make sure I get that plug in.
You did? I'm trying to wipe the smile off my face.
One more reporter. Adriana Gomez from El Paso Times asks, are there going to be any differences in metropolitan areas such as El Paso, where it's already a majority minority-driven population with 80% of Hispanics living there? And can you say anything on efforts being done to reach the illegal immigrant population who traditionally do not trust the government?
Well, let me take that second question first. The census is the one governmental activity in which everybody who resides in this country has both the right and the obligation to participate. So this is the one activity where the Constitution says that every person should be counted. So my organization, NALEO, is working in a coalition with other national Latino organizations, including SEIU, Mi Familia Vota, NCLR, LULAC, CHCI, the National Hispanic Bar Association, Dominican American National Roundtable, Cuban American National Council, and an endless group of other local and state organizations, so that we have an unprecedented mass mobilization of our community leadership and infrastructure to reach every single Latino family with a message about the importance of the census. Because the only way we truly are going to avoid a census undercount of Latinos is if Latinos want to be counted. So our strategy is going to be able to communicate the importance to our future of being counted. So we're continuing this campaign that we began in 2007 with Ya es hora ciudadanía, it's time citizenship, that we wanted to build on the enthusiasm we saw from these massive mobilizations that we saw in 2006, tap that enthusiasm and channel it into impact, and get 1.4 million people to apply for citizenship and 1 million through by 2008. We followed that up with Ya es hora, ve y vota. It's time, go and vote. And so we saw 2.7 million Latinos go to the polls in November. So now we've transitioned that campaign to Ya es hora, hágase contar. It's time, make yourself count. So our hope is that by branding this campaign, the community will understand that marching, naturalizing, voting, and being counted are all part and parcel of this empowerment movement we're witnesses to.
And the other question was what, about urban areas?
Urbanized areas. Well, let me mention a little bit about that. One of the things that you have in terms of the Hispanic population is the Hispanic population tends to be more diverse in this country as opposed to concentrated. The African American community tends to be more concentrated in pockets, in particularly in urbanized areas. This is likely to have a significant impact on the redistricting side of things, because as Arturo says, if you put coalitions together with Hispanics and African Americans, it'll help undo some of that bleaching that took place really starting in the 1990 round of redistricting. So you'll start seeing more uniform kind of communities coming into being where people will be able to join together.
Very good. Other questions from here in the room?
Hi, Charlie Erickson with Hispanic Link News Service, and I have one for Arturo. Arturo, tell us a little bit more detail about what California is doing in splitting up its reapportionment responsibilities. Who's on this commission? Are Hispanics represented? And how is it going to work with the legislature, where in the past, the districts that were congressional districts were generally half and half, Senate districts and a quarter. They had coordination. Is that going to disappear this time, or could it?
Well, that's yet to be seen, because there's now a new dynamic, as you referred to, in California with the passage of Proposition 11, which my organization vigorously opposed, because we thought it was a fundamentally flawed reform effort at redistricting. We're not opposed to redistricting processes or independent commissions, but we are opposed to such schemes that does not guarantee the ability of Latinos to participate fully and to have an impact on the process. And that's, in fact, what we're going to experience. There is a system set up where anybody can apply to be on the commission, and that gets whittled down to 160 people, who then gets whittled down to 60 people, who then are randomly selected to be on this commission of 15. One of the problems with that is the people who wrote this really did not understand redistricting. So they wrote in some things like,
Yes.
if you have given to a candidate in the past 10 years, you're conflicted out. Well, don't you want somebody who's paying attention to politics and to the political system to be somebody that you're going to tap into for this kind of commission? But no, they've conflicted those types of folks out of the process. By splitting the process, by giving legislative redistricting to the commission and keeping congressional lines with the legislature, you now have put advocates and the public at a disadvantage. Because now you have two processes going down simultaneously that you're going to have to monitor. And you're going to have to watch, what are the shenanigans that probably will happen with the legislature, like they always do, and then trying to make sure that these commissioners at least understand what the hell they're supposed to be doing. And there's no guarantee of that either. So it's an untried experiment in California. We always seem to be able to come up with the best and the worst of ideas. So we'll see how this one plays out.
As a follow-up, what is NALEO doing in staffing or funding or getting support for monies so that it can help do an effective job to ensure in California and elsewhere that Hispanic perspectives are well represented with the new lineup?
Well, we've been fortunate to have been funded by the James Irvine Foundation to do just that. And we're in the process of hiring staff to actually mobilize Latino leadership up and down the state to get Latinos to apply to be on the commission. And then if they make it through the whittling process, to help them through so that they could ultimately be in the pool that gets randomly selected. We also will follow up with an effort to get Latino communities to participate in both redistricting processes so that Latino communities and community leaders are able to propose their own lines, use data, use software that will be available, publicly available, to participate in the lines, testify before committees, and create the public record so that what we saw happen in 2000 is not repeated when Latinos were dramatically disenfranchised, particularly in congressional lines.
So that Gloria won't get bombarded with emails, you want to tell people where to send their resumes?
You can look at our website at www.naleo.org.
Very good. Let's take one or two more questions before we close. Right here.
The next step beyond getting a hold of the process is the legal process. We have a legacy of very bad court decisions that have been coming up, particularly in Texas during the 90s, and we need to be prepared to fight the legacy. Fortunately, we have a Supreme Court justice, I think, which will be helpful. But I think the failure that we had in the 90s was the lack of money for attorneys to pursue these cases. our opponents had oodles of money to do it, and we didn't. And that we can't allow that to happen again this year. We ought to be preparing now for a very strong and larger effort to protect voter rights through the courts.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I'm hopeful that with a reinvigorated MALDEF under new leadership, will restore its voting rights program to its vigor that it had. You know, Nina Perales in San Antonio is one of the leading minds on redistricting law. We expect her to play a key role in leading a new generation of voting rights attorneys, hopefully. But back to my earlier point, this is where we need leadership from this Justice Department and the voting rights section to make sure that they vigorously enforce the Voting Rights Act in this cycle of redistricting.
All right, well, why don't we leave it there? We'll be available for those who have follow-up questions. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank again Simon Rosenberg and Andres and NDN for hosting this event and for contributing to this report. The report is available online at americasvoiceonline.org, and we'll be following up with subsequent reports in the coming weeks and months. And we look forward to a vigorous debate about immigration reform in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you very much.